Hey everybody, it's Maria from cardbomb.com. Thanks for joining me today for a video on Tonic Studios Nuvo Shimmer powders. These powders are really fun to work with and can be used in a variety of different ways, and I'm going to show you a few different ways to use them during this video. There are 8 different colors of these Nuvo Shimmer powders, but at the time that I filmed this video I only had 4 of them, so that's what you'll see today. I'm also going to be using a spray bottle and water brush pens that are filled with either alcohol or water. The first thing I'm going to do is use a piece of watercolor paper and sprinkle some of the blue Blitz powder onto it. Next I'm adding some solar flare, and I really discovered that the best way to get the powder out is to just gently tap on the back end of the bottle. If you squeeze them, you often get a big burst of powder and you end up with more on the paper than you really wanted. Now that I've got my pigment powder down on the paper, I'm going to use my spray bottle to get it wet. And you can see that the colors are starting to blend together now, and the more water that I add, the more that they start to bleed together. One of the cool things about these pigment powders is that if you want your work to be a little more saturated, all you have to do is add more color as you go along. Something that I've learned about these pigment powders is that they really look best if you leave them to dry naturally without using your heat tool. So at this point in my learning process I hadn't figured that out, and I just wanted to dry this quickly for the sake of the video, and you can see that I got a lot of hard edges in there, which might be the look that you're going for, but if you want a smooth watercolory look like I had before I hit this with the heat tool, just set your work aside and let it dry naturally on its own. I wanted to try and hide some of those hard edges, so I added more color and more water, and luckily this product is really forgiving, so if you go in and add a second layer on top, you can hide a lot of those hard edges. And you can see that I did go back in and use my heat tool, but I used my piercing tool and my finger to smooth out some of those hard edges this time so that I had a much smoother look. I quickly cleaned up my mess with a baby wipe, and now I'm starting again with a piece of watercolor paper, but this time I'm putting the water down first and then adding the shimmer powder. And you can see how I could just stop right here. That's so beautiful. My paper wasn't completely saturated, so when the powder hit it, it gave a really crystalline, magical look. Now I'm adding some storm cloud pigment powder and a little bit of solar flare, and I'm going for something of a galaxy background look. Now pay attention to when there's not a lot of water, those colors stay really separated, but when I start adding a lot of water they really do blend together. So you have to pay attention to the colors that you pick so you don't end up making something really muddy. Luckily these colors all blend together really well, but if you were to use, for example, a blue and an orange color, you probably wouldn't be very happy with the result you got when they mixed together. They would look very muddy. So I'm using my paper towel to pull some of the excess water off the edges of my paper, and right here is where I should have set that aside and let it dry naturally, because look how pretty that is. But instead I grab my heat tool and I ruin it a little bit. It does turn out well, but it does not turn out as beautifully as it would have if I had just, set it aside and left it alone. But there is a little heat tool trick I'm using here, and my paper was starting to curl, so I heated it from the back, curled it up all the way, and now I'm hitting it back from the front. It's going to completely straighten out flat again, and it's not going to have any warping. So if your paper's starting to act funky on you, dry it from the back and then hit it back from the front so that both sides are dry, and you shouldn't have any warping. Now I'm adding a little bit more color. And this time I finally get smart, and after I add the color I just hit it with a quick spritz of water, which gives the color some texture, and I decide to leave it and put it off to the side to dry as it is. Now I'm using my mess and just adding a little bit more pigment powder to it, because I'm going to do a different technique now. So after I'm done sprinkling the colors of powder onto my plastic background, I spray a piece of watercolor paper, spray the pigment powder, and press them together. This lifts the pigment powder onto the watercolor paper and gives it such a soft, smooth watercolor look. I really like the way that it looks, and you could stop right here and leave it. I would get a paper towel and wipe up some of the hard edges of the drips, but you could have just left it like that. I chose to add a little bit more powder just for some texture, and I put that off to the side to dry. And now I'm using another piece of watercolor just to pick this up. And this time I am going to use my heat tool on purpose, because this time what I want to show you is that these pigment powders act quite a bit like watercolors, in that if you mix wet and wet, the colors are going to blend, but if you dry the bottom layer first and add another layer on top, you will really see the separation between the layers. So this technique that I'm doing right now shows the way that you can use these in order to layer the different colors. So I just got 2 layers of that, the greenish background, and now I'm adding the blue Blitz, and I'm just going to get some layers of blue Blitz kind of ink smushed onto the top of that green layer. So I like the way that looks. It's something that you could use to make a really textured, spattered looking background, and to me this looks really like the ocean. Another way that you can use these pigment powders is to mix them up with water or alcohol using a water brush. So right now I've got a water brush that's filled with water, and I'm mixing it with some Storm Cloud pigment powder that I've just put into a palette, and I'm just flicking it all over the background to add a little bit more texture, add a little bit more detail. It's easy to clean out these water brushes if you've never used them before. You just squeeze them, water squirts out, and you can easily clean the brush. And you can see how I can go straight from that black to that yellow with very minimal effort, and I can splatter yellow onto the background. Here's a quick look at how these splatters will look on a finished background, and you can also use the mixture to paint as I did on this moon. Now let's move on to the next technique, and this one is a no-go. I decided to leave it in the video so that you don't have to experiment with it for yourself. So I used watercolor paper and a water brush filled with rubbing alcohol or surgical spirits if you happen to be in the UK, and I tried to watercolor with it. I like to watercolor with alcohol sometimes because I find it cuts down on drying time, especially if I'm using regular cardstock, but on this watercolor paper it did not work. I tried to reactivate it with water and that didn't work either, so this for me was kind of a throwaway piece. But I decided to use the same technique and try it with water, and it works beautifully. So just to be clear, it's not a matter of the shimmer powder not being a fantastic pigment source. It was really just the alcohol on the watercolor paper that didn't work, because here I am doing the exact same thing with water and it's beautiful. So I love how smooth that looks, and I decided that I wanted to have a little bit more texture and another layer of color to it, and so I added more of the black, and then I decided I was going to use that technique of spattering to make a galaxy background with some golden universe in there. And I really like the way that one turned out, so I'll set that off to the side to dry, and this is what it looked like on a finished card. It does dry a little bit darker. Now this next technique is one of my absolute favorite ways to use this shimmer powder. I used glossy cardstock instead of watercolor cardstock this time, and I put down a couple different colors and spritzed with water, and just look at how amazing that looks instantly. It gives kind of a crystalline, kaleidoscopy look. The colors just stay so vibrant and you see so much of the shimmer with this look. Okay, on to the next look, and this is where I'm going to pull out my water brush filled with alcohol again. So this time I'm using 80-pound black cardstock, so it's not a watercolor cardstock at all. It's just regular cardstock. And I wanted to show you that you can use these on dark cardstock as well, as long as you're careful not to warp your paper by using too much water. So that's why I decided to use the alcohol in my water brush this time, and it works perfectly. I just mixed the pigment powders up with the alcohol and used them to watercolor, and I'm really happy with the way that turned out. I felt like I could get a lot of shimmer and a lot of color onto the paper, and you can really see what color I used. And so you could use these just to watercolor an image, just to do a background, whatever you might like. Just remember to use the alcohol so you don't get warping or pilling. And that's it for today, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment. Hop on over to my blog at cardbomb.com for links to products. And I hope you all have an amazing day, and I will see you back here real soon. Bye for now.